US, and other places as well. And that's wonderful. And the committee members for Daniel's defense are Professor Thomas Eisenbart, who's also a co-advisor, and Professor Simha Setumadvan, as an external committee member. Really appreciate him participating in this, as well as our Donald Brown, who's the department head here. He's the official committee member in all of our PhDs. And just a couple of pointers about the process, so you know about the structure the way we do PhDs at WPI, which is pretty similar to most of the places in the US, maybe a little bit different from European and Canadian defenses. Basically, we have an open session, which is what this is about now. In the next 45, 50 minutes, the candidate, the PhD candidate, will give a presentation on the work they've done over the last several years, right, including their PhD work. And this session is open to the public, and it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to interrupt. Anybody can ask questions, not just the committee members. So that's the open public presentation. You can, delay your question to the end of the presentation or even during the presentation. As long as it's within reason, you can ask questions. And by reason, I mean because we are kind of time bound, right? So the defense itself can go on as long as we want, but in terms of what we're aiming for, it's about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, maybe including questions up to an hour, roughly speaking. And then we will ask the public members to leave the room so that we can go to a closed session. So it's going to be just the candidate and the committee members. There will be a closed session. And after which, just the committee members will convene and decide on the PhD outcome. So that's the outline. And without further review, without any further delays, so Daniel, please go ahead and give your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. So the title of my PhD dissertation is Revisiting Isolated and Trusted Execution via Microarchitectural Cryptanalysis. So with that, I'm gonna motivate how we do security in modern day computers. We have moved from these single user, single task computers now to a much more complex and diverse set of computers. On the server side, we have all sorts of high compute capability servers that can run many different services at the same time on the same hardware. And the same way even on our client workstations like our mobile phone. Now this mobile phone is so capable that we can run many different applications at the same time. And each of these applications, they have their own security requirements. And basically now in this modern security environment, we have like all these sort of applications and operating systems that they are running on both the server side and on the client side. And we have now lots of adversaries who are trying to basically compromise the security of our system by bypassing some local restrictions. For example, the adversaries basically try to infect an application or try to trick us to install a malicious app, and then that malicious app try to steal the information from your banking credentials or the web services or other things. But we have come a long way. We have come up with lots of different ways to create some architectural isolation. And this architectural isolation that we have in place basically creates some virtual boundaries. So each of these applications or operating systems, or generally any sort of security boundaries, can only access a specific part of memory and a specific part of the hardware. So they cannot mess with the computation of other processors or other users. And they are basically restricted in this isolated environment. So this sounds great. It seems like we have figured this out, but are these isolations good? Are we basically sure that nobody can break outside of this isolation? So I have had these problems for a long time, that generally when we implement things on software and hardware, things can go wrong in many different ways. So that abstraction we had in mind that things should work securely, most of the times don't apply in practice. An example of this, for example, is the heartbleed vulnerability that was found by some researchers in 2014. We see that the TLS, that the secure communication between these computers, is designed in a very secure way, but we saw that there was a simple vulnerability in the OpenSSL cryptographic library that would allow an attacker to remotely leak the encryption key and basically compromise some of these security guarantees. So this vulnerability, it affected millions of computers because OpenSSL is a very popular cryptographic library. And it was just a simple buffer overflow that is a very well understood problem for over a decade. And we see that the price of one line of bad code, this mem copy in the OpenSSL code, basically caused this security vulnerability. So, but this is not over. We have now vulnerabilities coming every day. These are like some of the logos that the researchers have designed for their research, for the vulnerabilities they have discovered. And there are more, like people do that all the time when they find a very critical vulnerability that affects lots of computing system, or it has new insights. People come up with these logos in our community to highlight the importance of these security issues. So why the problem is why don't we just stop using computers here? Now we have all sorts of vulnerabilities that coming every day. So why engineers create these problems? Why can't we get it right? I would say one big problem is the complexity. So when we talk about engineers, software engineers, researchers trying to implement secure computing system, we generally have just a understanding of this tip of the iceberg, which we write some program with some high-level programming language. But our computers are much more complex underneath. We have so many layers of different firmwares, different hardware elements inside the CPU and inside the entire hardware, including the system on a chip, that nowadays these are becoming so many complex, so layers that even the vendors that design and develop them sometimes don't understand them properly anymore. And another important thing is these layers, these isolation layers, sometimes engineers also work in separate layers. So hardware engineers don't have the proper understanding of the software, and vice versa. And this has created new security problems. So some of the security problems are deep inside the microarchitecture, and that's what we're going to talk about in this talk. So we said microarchitecture. So microarchitecture security, it kind of started in early 2000 by some researcher, Ostrick et al., Percival, and some others. They introduced these new type of attacks called cache attacks. And the idea of these cache attacks is that these are some side channel attacks that can be exploited from the software. So we have a user level adversary who already has some level of access to this computer, but he cannot have access to other applications or the administrative password and things like that. But this user adversary can basically measure the behavior of the CPU, the timing of this cache subsystem, to leak some information about other processes or the operating system. And basically, by exploiting this software-based side channel attacks, the adversary can violate some of the security guarantees that are provided by architectural isolation. So these attacks have been started like almost more than a decade. People also have come up with some countermeasures, but there are specific problems with microarchitecture security that basically we try to address in this basically dissertation. So people have come up with these ad hoc countermeasures, for example, for cache attacks, things like partitioning the cache or detecting cache misses to see if somebody is doing a lot of cache miss and attacking, or things like constant cache access patterns, so the adversary cannot learn anything from this, cache attack. But when we look at the industry, there are either two trends. Like either these countermeasures are either not used at all, so nobody actually used them. It's just they have been proposed and they only have some academic value, or even the ones that are used, like for example, some of the constant time implementations are sometimes ineffective because they are limited in terms of what we are trying to mitigate. So why is that the problem? I personally have identified three main reasons that we have this problem with microarchitectural security. So one problem also go back to that complexity that we mentioned earlier. This microarchitectural security is a very new research topic, and we have not figured out all the attack vectors on a CPU. So this is still too early. So when we come up with these mitigations, we are just trying to address one example of a problem. We are not trying to truly fix the microarchitecture and make it secure, because it's too early. We don't know all the attack vectors, and it takes a lot of manual analysis and reverse engineering to figure out what are the other attack vectors inside a CPU. So the other problem is that these vulnerabilities generally have a very fuzzy impact. When a researcher finds a new attack vector, we don't even know how does this affect the software, because it depends on so many different how we execute the software and other environmental effects that we don't even know the real impact of these vulnerabilities. And an example of that is, for example, the Spectra vulnerability that people have proposed lots of defense for it, but on the attack side, we don't even also we don't understand the actual impact of these attacks. And the third problem that is also complementary to those two first ones is that we have kind of a lack of expertise and tooling in this direction. There are just a few research labs who do research on microarchitectural security. And in the past 2 years, it has become also more popular, but we don't have proper tooling to basically understand the software or analyze the software to see if they are vulnerable. And we also don't have maybe proper simulation or hardware features to actually understand if a processor is vulnerable to some of these attacks. So this tooling may also help to this basically to other points to improve, because we can automate things and maybe find things faster and find the impact better. So to address some of these problems, I worked in several different problems during my PhD years. And the first thing that I'm going to start with is some of the microarchitectural side channels that basically I've uncovered through analysis of the CPU microarchitecture. So we mentioned that there are these cache attacks, and the idea is that these cache attacks that they have also different names like flush and reload, prime and probe, evict and reload. These cache attacks essentially allow a local adversary to leak the memory access pattern of other users that are using the same computer. And this memory access is leaked with a 64-byte granularity, which means the attacker
Daniel?
can, yeah, go ahead.
Sima here. Before we go too deep into this, how do you define microarchitecture? What's your definition of microarchitecture? And specifically, what does microarchitectural security mean?
Okay, so my answer to that would be we have generally maybe different layers of defining a microarchitecture. For example, when we talk about the system on a chip, sometimes we have some microarchitecture just for the connectivity of different elements on a system on a chip, like different buses and small caches on a SoC. And but when we focus on a specific accelerator like a CPU core or a GPU, we basically have again a microarchitecture inside that CPU or GPU core. To basically distinguish it, we generally.
Okay. I think let's hold on for a minute. So let's try this slightly differently. Why is cache a microarchitectural structure?
So, okay, that's a good question. So traditionally or historically, cache was designed to speed up applications. And this programs, the software was supposed to be totally agnostic to the cache and not basically being able to manipulate the cache directly. So that's why it was designed inside the microarchitecture, not part of the architecture. But eventually nowadays we have moved to a world that this cache now is part of the software. Basically, software can modify the behavior of the cache or trick the cache to be in a specific situation. So sometimes now the vendors also have some ISA instruction that allows the cache to be manipulated. So sometimes it's blurry whether something is part of the architecture or microarchitecture now. But generally here, when we talk about microarchitectural security, we are basically talking about things that happens inside the CPU to execute the applications, not things that necessarily was supposed to allow the software to program the applications that way. I don't know if I explained that.
I kind of, that definition is a definition of how things are right now, and it's a very nice historical explanation, right? But technically, caches are no longer microarchitecture because a programmer can manipulate the state of the cache using explicit instructions that are not privileged. And if you have a program with a cache flush instruction and you run it on another system, or you take out the cache flush instructions, some programs will actually fail. So to think of cache as a microarchitectural structure is anachronistic, right? So there may be some parts of the processor that should not be visible to the programmer using the ISA, and it's okay to call them microarchitectural, but to call the cache attack a microarchitectural attack is, I don't know if it's valid any longer, right? It's
right.
like a bow to precedence, but not really,
Right.
in tune with times or accurate. So
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I totally agree with that notion that nowadays it has become more blurry, but there are also some people in the architecture and microarchitecture community that believe that we shouldn't also allow the software to have too much visibility. And this idea of allowing the cache to be architecturally available was just for some specific software vendors like Microsoft wanting to do things in a specific way, and basically
I don't think that's true at all. Like caches, it's not a vendor asking for things to do. There are fundamental reasons why caches have been exposed. Like if you have vector instructions and you have streaming stores, you need to actually flush the cache before you can operate on the vector instructions. If you don't do that, you will get incorrect results. So when streaming SSE was added, cache flush instructions were added because for correctness reasons, right? It's not a particular vendor requirement. It's an architectural correctness requirement for vector processing.
Right.
And so I also I hesitate to accept the characterization that the boundary is fuzzy. I don't think the boundary is really fuzzy, right? It's like basically, if we keep calling caches microarchitectural attacks, I think we are kind of propagating this notion that it is fuzzy, while actually the definition is very clear. If there is a way through an ISA to access a structure, it's not microarchitecture, right?
Well, maybe that's true. Like if we look at architectures one by one, but so like similar to the example you are discussing regarding cache, for example, some microarchitectures or architectures, they allow the software to basically modify the behavior of branch predictor. And this is also becoming very popular, for example, on now mitigating some, like it's discussed for some with some people, how do we mitigate a spectra? Should we allow the software to control the branch predictor?
Yeah, but this is okay.
So if we basically expose it to the architecture, we cannot call it microarchitecture anymore, or is it a microarchitecture and also architecture as well? Because basically it has both aspects, right?
Okay, so I think, I don't want to get into this discussion while you're in this first few slides. So one thing that I would concretely, one piece of thing to do is go back to the original definition of ISA in the 1966 paper, where the authors of, when the IBM basically invented the term instruction set architecture, go back to that paper and think about how exactly they define the ISA and see if what structures within the processor fit that definition. Okay, and then if it fits that definition, then yes, it's architecture. If it doesn't fit that definition, then it's maybe microarchitecture. So that may be a good way to provide more clarity on this rather than accepting what researchers have been just using, perhaps incorrectly sometimes.
Right. Okay, so I look into that resource definitely, and yeah, and I agree. I think there should be more thoughts going on what is defined an architecture or what is defined a microarchitecture. But maybe it's better that I highlight that when we talk about microarchitectural security, some of the elements of it are also architectural. And we also see in this talk that also we do some attacks that are using the architectural features that are defined by the ISA. So I think when we talk about microarchitectural security, we don't necessarily also basically narrow ourselves down to things that are defined as microarchitecture, because this definition can sometimes change from one CPU to another, or one context to another. Okay, so I guess I continue if that's fine, and we can
Thanks,
discuss
Sim.
this further.
Go ahead, Dini.
Thanks. So the idea is when an attacker basically learn the cache memory access pattern, then they can use this to learn something about some security critical application. For example, some cryptographic applications, they do some secret dependent memory accesses, and if an attacker can basically probe the cache access pattern, they can learn something about the secrets that are processed and break crypto like AES or RSA crypto system. So one important thing about these cache attacks is that the attacker generally learns about these upper address bits of a memory address. So these memory addresses that are used to access the data, generally they have many different bits, but the last 6 bits is not visible to a cache attacker because the cache has a 64-byte granularity. So we wanted to, in one of the projects I work on, we wanted to see if there is a way to basically learn more bits of information about these bits of address that are not visible to a cache attacker. So when we look at the CPU's memory subsystem, there is so much complexity going on there. So we have the different levels of cache, but we also have some internal buffers called the store buffer and load buffer that they help the processor to execute these memory operations in parallel and basically serialize them and execute them correctly. So when we have these instructions on the left side and we allocate them in the allocation queue, then we assign some reorder buffer entry, and then we execute them with the help of this store buffer, load buffer, and then the next levels of cache. So one thing to also is important to emphasize here that the applications we write nowadays on our that runs on our laptop or desktop computers, they use a virtual address space, and we have these virtual addresses that the programs use to execute different operations. But the CPU at the end of the day has to translate this virtual address to a physical address that actually defines how to map the data to different parts of the memory. So there is a component inside the CPU called TLB, and here we have a data TLB, for example, that translates this virtual address to a basically physical page table entry. But this TLB is like a cache itself, so it doesn't have all the translation. And whenever the TLB fails to do the translation, it asks the operating system to translate that virtual address to a physical address, and then again update the TLB. So this operation is very time consuming, and because of that, we have all sorts of other optimization inside the CPU subsystem to make sure that the memory operations can execute faster and they don't stall because of this expensive translation or things like that. So one of these optimization is called store forwarding, and the idea is that here, when there are some pending store operation and some pending load operations that are not fully executed, we can look at some of the store buffer addresses and load buffer addresses, and whenever there is a dependency between them, we can forward the data from the store buffer to the load buffer directly. So it doesn't have to go all the way through all the next levels of the cache hierarchy. So, but the problem is on some CPU architectures, they basically do this based on partial address checking. And the idea here is that when we want to check if the load is dependent on the store, we don't necessarily want to go through that whole translation because the translation is expensive. So we just look at the last 12 bits of virtual address and physical address, because these last 12 bits are the same for both. And then we make a guess and we try to forward the data from the store buffer to the load buffer. And this guess sometimes can go wrong. If it goes wrong, then the CPU is gonna verify that it was wrong in the last stage in the reorder buffer, and going to flush the result if it's wrong and re-execute it. So this is working great for normal application, but an adversary can create this condition again and again to basically leak some information about the computation. So we came up with this attack that exploit these features of 4K aliasing on some Intel CPUs that does address aliasing checking. And the idea here is that this attacks allows us to basically measure the timing delay of this dependency checking. And when the load memory operation re-executes, we see a false dependency because there was no basically true dependency between them. And then this timing delay can be measured to leak some information about those address bits that we couldn't see with the cache attack. So now with this attack that we called memjam, we have an intra-cache line resolution because we managed to learn these 4 bits of additional information with this memjam attack. So memjam compared to a cache attack, it has a 4-byte granularity instead of a 64-byte granularity. And basically, we want to see if these 4 bits of information gives us any better privilege as an attacker. So now the question is, why should we care about this improved resolution of this memjam attack? So we use this memjam to actually do an additional cryptanalysis and see that some of the symmetric encryption primitives like AES or other block ciphers can be attacked more efficiently, and also we can bypass some of the ad hoc mitigations people have developed. For example, we looked at this implementation of AES that uses S boxes, and they basically implement this in a way that it has a constant cache access pattern. So this implementation from IPP crypto library at the time, or also SGX SDK, basically is not vulnerable to a cache attacker. But we figured that with memjam attack, you can basically learn if an adversary accesses the first 4 bytes of this cache line. So if there is more SBox lookup that goes to the first 4 bytes of this SBox table, then you can get a higher timing. And then we applied some of the methodologies from like differential power analysis and correlation power analysis that people applied to attack AES with physical attacks. Here, we applied the same methodology to basically leak the AES key. And here, for example, we can see that on the right side, there are the correlations that we have computed. The expected correlation is marked in red, that we use the synthetic data to simulate this, and the blue shows the correlation we gained using the memjam attack, and the index that has the highest peak actually represent the correct key bytes. So we did similar attacks also in other symmetric ciphers in our basically dissertation, like on SM4 or triple DES. But the idea is that this attack bypass any sort of cache countermeasures for these symmetric encryption systems. We also looked at some other more complex behavior of this memory subsystem and address checking. There are some undocumented behavior also here. And we looked at, for example, some of the patents that describes how these dependencies are checked and validated inside the memory subsystem. And there are some mentions of things like there is a loose net check and there is a fine net check. And basically, the CPU designer suggests that the loose net check only checks the last 12 bits, but in a fine net check, you may also leak some other additional bits of the physical address or the virtual address. So we wanted to check if there is other aliasing that we can exploit here. And at the end of the day, we came up with this attack that we can leak some information about the physical address. So the idea is that in our attack, basically, we allocate a large number of virtual pages. Then we do a number of memory stores, to some of them to 64 pages here. And then we also do a memory load. And all these stores and loads have the same last 12 bits. So we hope that if there is a dependency between the stores and loads, we can observe some timing behavior for the load. When we scan a large number of virtual pages, at some point we reach a point that when we hit a store address that has the same 8-bit of physical page frame number as the load, there is a very high timing latency here. So with that, an attacker can basically keep scanning until he has lots of virtual pages that they have the same 8-bit of physical page frame number. Why is this information useful again? Why do we want to learn more bit of addresses? So there are some attacks that relies on knowledge of the physical page frame number, and they perform better if we know about the physical page frame number. So when we translate this virtual frame number to a physical frame number, there is these bits of address that a user should not have access to, and people actually have restricted the operating system so the user cannot access these addresses. And because of that, if we learn about this, it's actually useful for other attacks. So when we learn about this additional 8-bit of address, we showed in a paper that you can do attacks like prime and probe on cache or row hammer much better. Okay, so far we just talked about attacks that leak some information about addresses inside the CPU. Now we're going to talk about a different type of attacks. Attacks that actually allows an adversary, a local adversary, to leak the actual data from the CPU subsystem. So 2018, there was this attacks called transient execution attacks, like by academics, they call it transient execution attacks. And mainly there was the Spectra attack and the meltdown attack. And the idea is that in the Spectra attack, the adversary can trick the branch predictors to leak some data from the CPUs. But in the meltdown attack, the attacker basically exploits some behavior of the CPU's memory subsystem to leak some data from the core. And the good thing about this meltdown attack was that it doesn't assume anything about the victim application. So you could leak any data from the entire kernel memory. So this meltdown attack, I'm going to just shortly mention it because it's also related to some of our contribution. But the idea is that the attacker tried to access a memory that is a privileged memory, like this is a kernel address, and by default, he should get an exception. But the attacker can additionally do some other tricks to actually turn this exception to a data leakage. And the idea is that in the first step, the attacker accesses this memory that is not allowed to access, but he also execute another instruction after that encode this memory access to a table lookup, and then he gets a cache access, and then he can go ahead and measure the behavior of the cache to see which index was accessed and leak the data. So after this step 2, we get an exception generally in the software, but that exception doesn't stop the cache behavior to be modified, so you can go ahead and leak this data. So these are the 3 steps of a meltdown attack. And after meltdown came, there were several CPU vendors, including Intel, that they were affected by this meltdown attack. And they tried to fix this vulnerability in the next version of the CPUs, like on, for example, Coffee Lake or Cascade Lake. These are some of the CPUs that came after that they were not vulnerable to meltdown. But us and some other groups, we looked at again at these problems, and we realized that you can still leak some data from the CPU. But this time, these new type of attacks that are called microarchitectural data sampling doesn't allow the attacker to fully control which part of the which exactly address you can leak. So you can leak some data from the CPU core, but you don't have full control over what address. So now we again have this local adversary who is running something inside the CPU and tries to leak some data. And generally, there are two threat models that this attacker try to compromise. One is the case that the attacker runs a thread on the same CPU through simultaneous multi-threading or hyper-threading, and the attacker basically tries to leak the information from the core that is put inside the core by the other thread. Another scenario of exploiting this MDS is also when a context switch happens, when basically a victim process executes some code and it puts some data inside the CPU core. And then when there is a context switch, and then the attacker process is supposed to execute some instruction, then the attacker tries to leak those information using microarchitectural data sampling. So these attacks came out. There were many different variations of it. And even before microarchitectural data sampling, there were attacks like Foreshadow or L1TF that basically leak data from the L1 cache. And now there are different variants of these attacks, these MDS attacks, that leaks data from different buffers inside the CPU. For example, the Fallout attack leaked data from the store buffer. And then there was zombie load and riddle that zombie load, for example, leaked data from the field buffer. So by leaking data from different buffers, you see also different data that belongs to other processes or other threads. And basically, we basically saw that, okay, there are different parts of these buffers that leak the data in MDS attacks. So there were some challenges when we were basically analyzing these MDS attacks, and that's where the contribution of my work here is represented. So the idea is that when we are reproducing these attacks, they are not very reliable. They may depend on so many different conditions, and there is no public tool to find new variants of these attacks or verify if a hardware, a new CPU, if it's properly mitigated. And there is also very fuzzy to quantify the impact of these leakages. And here I have like a figure that I created for some of the conditions that the CPU has to check to correctly execute a memory load operation. And there are so many of these conditions, and some of these attacks we have seen, like a zombie load or fallout or riddle, they basically exploit different behaviors of this condition checking to leak different part of data or trigger these attacks. So we realize it's really hard to exhaustively test all these conditions to first find new variants of these attacks or new ways to exploit them. Second, to see if a new CPU is secure against this attack. So we came up with this tool based on a fuzzing-based approach called transitor. And the idea is that we're gonna do this test in a pseudo-random fashion. So instead of the first step, choosing a specific type of memory load operation, we're gonna combine all those conditions that we have come up that the CPU may check, like if there is a memory that is cached or not cached, different permission checks, or like different alignments for this memory load operation. And we're gonna randomly pick a memory load operation that replicate one of these conditions. But before that, we're also gonna put some data inside the CPU core, some noun values by doing some store or load operation. And we call this buffer grooming because we try to do our best to control what data we put in what CPU buffers with the best of ability we have from the ISA. So we also add some random instructions because based on our experience, when you add these instructions, you randomly maybe leak more data or less because these random instructions change the timing of the pipeline and how this dependency checking, these basically exceptions and the behavior memory subsystem leaks data. So with this transitor, we call this the synthesization phase. So we come up with a code snippet, and that code snippet is similar to a meltdown attack, and it's supposed to generate a variant of the meltdown. So when we execute this code, basically we look if we have leaked any of those data that we put into the pipeline. If there is a leakage, then we evaluate further by some manual analysis or using performance counters to see if basically that leakage is a new leakage, and also to see why the CPU has leaked that data and basically find the root cause of it. So we use this transitor to exhaustively analyze a few of the Intel CPU architecture and also some AMD CPUs. And we found new insights about these attacks, and we have discussed this like extensively in a paper. But the idea is that, for example, some of the things we found, people assumed before that for fallout, when you leak the data from the store buffer, you need to have the 4K aliasing condition. But some of our proof of concept shows that even with just some cache offset aliasing and some way of the way the transitor generated these random instructions, sometimes you leak data from a store buffer without 4K aliasing. We also came up with a new way to exploit the line field buffer similar to zombie load, and we call this attack Medusa. So why is this, why there is a new attack here? So the idea is that when we look at these new different variants of meltdown, foreshadow, fallout, all these meltdown type of attacks, so we see that for all of these attacks, we control some bits of information, sometimes all the bits of addresses. But for zombie load that leaks data from the line field buffer and from other threads on the CPU, we only control the last 6 bits of the address. And I took this picture from our zombie load paper, but the idea is that now with zombie load, you leak lots of noisy information because you essentially execute, you essentially leak any memory load that is executing on the other hyperthread. So now Medusa, the way it has the proof of concept is generated, it only leaks data that is right combining data. And I'm not getting to the detail of what is the right combining data, but the idea is that some instructions like rep move or rep store or a string copy operation that are used a lot for memory copy routines or file IO, they are always executed in a right combining fashion. So this special crafted Medusa attack only always this right combining operation. So it's less noisy and we can do the attack in a more targeted way. So to show the impact of this Medusa attack, we also again came up with some cryptanalysis attack. That's as you have seen, this is kind of an ingredient of my work that I always apply some cryptanalysis to show the impact of the attack in practice. So here, what we did is that we look at the OpenSSL, and OpenSSL has a very good implementation of RSA because people have previously proposed different type of attacks. So OpenSSL is generally considered secure now against cache attacks because it has been audited many times. But when you execute OpenSSL, there is some memory copy routine that loads the key, and we realize that when we apply the Medusa attack, you always leak some chunk of this RSA key, and we created a template based on what part of the key are leaked more with Medusa. Then we look at the decoded key, we see that these are the RSA key parameters, the P and Q are the prime factors that shape the RSA key. And we saw that these chunks basically leak some part of this P and Q always more often. So we basically looked at some of the literature, what can we do to break the entire RSA based on just chunks of P and Q that we leaked with Medusa. So there is this technique by Coppersmith that allows us to recover the rest of the RSA key when we have 1/3 of the knowledge of the key. So here, this basically Coppersmith technique is a technique that can solve the hidden number problem. So here we create a n-dimensional hidden number problem where n is related to the number of recovered chunks, and then we feed this to a lattice-based algorithm that find the shortest vector, and we can use this to recover the unknown part of this P and essentially break the RSA. So we show that transitor helps us to show the impact of these attacks better, find new ways to exploit them. But we also tested some CPUs that they were claimed to be even resistant against MDS attack after we developed this tool. So we basically tested one of the Ice Lake CPUs that Intel donated to us, and when we executed some tests on the CPU in March 2000, basically March 2020, then we realized that basically MDS vulnerabilities that are supposed to be mitigated, for the most part, they are mitigated, but one of the variants, the store buffer leakage, still works on the CPU. So we talked to Intel about this, and we completed a responsible disclosure with them. And in response, we realized that apparently some of the CPUs that were shipped outside, they didn't have the correct microcode patch, so they were not secure against it. We did also an analysis, and we realized that that's correct. All the CPUs that have a microcode before 2020, they are still vulnerable to store buffer data leakage. And Intel also updated the errata in the architectural specification that mentioned this problem. So we basically transitor shows here that testing CPUs is also is something that we can do with automation, and that's a useful thing to do. So far, all these basically problems we discussed was in the threat model of a local adversary trying to leak data from other users on the local. But there are other threat models too that we have to deal on our modern computer environment. So one thing that is now a popular research direction is called trusted computing. And the idea is that in the cloud environment on our mobile phone, there are so many different hardware and software components. And these hardware and software components essentially, they are not trusted. We don't know which entity to trust. Even if one vendor or one entity is compromised, then they can just steal our data and we cannot do anything about it. So with trusted computing, the idea is we're going to build computers, build systems that only compute on our data, but we don't give the data to the vendors. So we don't basically allow them to access this data in plain view or plain text. And there are many different good examples of the usage of this trusted computing, that it creates a whole new avenue of industry and products. For example, we would have privacy preserving machine learning. We would have anonymous blockchain transactions using this trusted computing technology. So this one of these trusted computing technologies is based on some CPU basically features that is called trusted execution environment. And Intel also, like other vendors like AMD or ARM, they have their own TEE basically design. And with Intel SGX, that is a TEE by Intel, the idea is that now you don't trust all these software layers on your computer. You only trust just some part of the hardware, which is only the CPU, and just some part of the application that is a module called enclave. So as a result, even if you have the entire operating system or hypervisor is compromised, you don't want your data that is inside that enclave to be exposed to an adversary. So here now we have an adversary that is much stronger. We call it a system level adversary that has full control over the operating system and hypervisor, but he's not supposed to access the data inside those basically enclaves. So we have seen that this system level adversarial model is actually a very strong adversarial model. And for example, some of the attacks we worked on earlier, like cache zoom, shows that you can basically leak, you can do a cache attack on an SGX enclave much better when you have a system level access, because you can interrupt the application, the enclave thread, and do these measurements over time and learn more information. So since then, when we started working on this SGX, like in 2016, and attacking SGX, there are now lots of people, lots of different attacks that has been proposed against SGX. Intel has taken the responsibility to mitigate some of these attacks with new microcodes or changing some of the architectural behaviors in new versions. But there are some other attacks that is the responsibility of the software developer to mitigate. And microarchitectural side channels that we discussed, that people can measure the cache or the different behavior of the memory subsystem, are some of those. But in addition to these microarchitectural side channels, there are some other attacks that people have proposed called control channel attack or deterministic attacks. So these attacks essentially exploit what is defined in the ISA for the CPU. And with the help of this attack, you can learn information about page accesses from the CPU. But these attacks are deterministic. There is no noise involved because you are not measuring the time or some physical behavior. You can just figure out from the bits of the page table entry whether a page has been accessed or not. So these deterministic attacks are great because they are very powerful. But one limitation of these deterministic attacks is that they only have a 4 kilobyte granularity. So some people have come up with, again, some ad hoc mitigation to make the access pattern oblivious to a 4 kilobyte resolution adversary. So the question is, can we do this better? So we came up with an attack called copycat. And the idea of this copycat attack is that we combine some previous attack techniques with this control channel attack to come up with this high resolution deterministic attack. So we know that in the SGX thread model, a malicious OS controlled the interrupt handler. And previously, people, including us and Jo Van Bolk and some other people, have used this behavior to actually exploit the basically SGX and learn some information. So there is this attack framework called SGX steps that it allows you to do single stepping over an enclave thread. So when we do the single stepping, two things happen. We interrupt the enclave thread very fast, that it either executes no instruction or it at most executes only one instruction. So at the end of the day, when we execute this thread, we're gonna count the number of IRQs that has happened. Here, for example, 15 IRQs. And if we can see which of those IRQs was no instruction, we can count the exact number of instructions that are executed. And we can do that because there is a page level entry that a system level adversary can read and even modify. And this A bit only set when at least one instruction is retired from a code base. So by combining these two information, we have an adversary that can deterministically count the number of instructions executed in an enclave thread. So this is still not a very strong attack because at best you learn a Hamming way of the enclave number of instructions. But one thing we can do, we can combine this with another oracle and create some checkpoints in the enclave thread. So for example, here we can figure out that this first page with the call instruction, a new code page has been accessed, and we put a checkpoint here, and then we count the number of instruction, and we know that this push instruction accesses the stack page, and again we put a checkpoint here, and so on. So now, in addition to learning what pages have been accessed, which was the contribution of previous attack, we have this additional attack vector that tells us how many instructions are executed when we are transitioning from one page to another. Then the next thing we did, we turned this to an attack that learned the outcome of branches in a deterministic fashion, and also with a very high resolution. For example, here we see that a code example that a page table attacker or a cache attacker cannot learn anything from it, because the left side of the branch and the right side of the branch, they both exactly execute the same function. But we see that there are different parameters passed to this function. And when that happens, the compiler at least generate one or two different instructions in this if statement. So by just counting the number of instructions from transitioning from one page to another, we can figure out what was the outcome of that branch. So this copycat attack helped us to actually come up with new cryptanalysis attack as well. So for example, there is a popular algorithm in cryptography that is called binary extended Euclidean algorithm. One of the usage of this algorithm is to compute the modular inverse that is used in ECDSA, RSA, and many other places. So previous attacks on this algorithm can only leak these high-level branches, that is these while loops, because these have lots of cache footprint or page table footprint. But with memjam, we realized that we can recover all the branches, all the if statement and everything in a deterministic fashion from start to end of this algorithm's execution without any noise, like all the outcome of these branches. So this helps us to come up with new single trace cryptanalysis attacks. And for example, here, this is one of the many examples we showed in the paper, but we have an operation again on RSA parameters Q and P during the RSA key generation. And this is called Q inverse mod P. And during this operation, that we can leak all the state of that algorithm. So we came up with a algorithmic attack by modifying some of the previous algorithms for branch and prune. And here the idea is that we know the knowledge of the n is a public parameter, and we know n is the result of P multiply Q. So this branch and prune algorithm we came up, essentially the idea is you make some guesses about the last bit of this P and Q, and based on these guesses, you would have 4 different possibilities that can happen. But 2 of these possibilities are eliminated instantly, because based on that relationship of P multiply Q, 2 of them don't match that algebraic behavior. So if we keep continuing doing this for the next bits, we would create a binary tree that is exhaustively grow, and traversing this binary tree to find the correct RSA key is almost as bad as brute forcing the RSA key. But with copycat, we can remove some of these branches. Some of these branches, when we make these guesses, we feed the data to this trace that we recovered from copycat. We see that those traces don't match, so we just eliminate those branches. When we did this, we essentially left with a leaf at the end, that leaf is the correct RSA key. So this copycat attack, we see that it has more benefits. We basically added another attack to this terminology, to this taxonomy of attacks on SGX that optimize the control channel attacks with the instruction level granularity. It's fully deterministic. We have tested this with millions of instructions. And this attack is also very easy to scale and replicate, because it doesn't rely on reverse engineering the branches or the microarchitectural components. And you can track all the branches of an enclave thread synchronously without any noise. So what are other environments? What are other trusted environments that we use in our computers? So we have seen that CPUs, they have all sorts of vulnerabilities. There is another hope that here we can make our computers have some trusted behavior. So there is this idea of having physically isolated security elements. And the basic idea here is that we have basically all these attacks that are coming. So why not just putting everything that is cryptographic operations or very secret critical inside a separate hardware? So if everything on the CPU side is compromised, we cannot access these cryptographic keys. So one of these basically cryptographic coprocessors is standardized by Trusted Computing Group, or TCG, and it's called Trusted Platform Module. And this Trusted Platform Module is supposed to be tamper resistant and sidechain resistant, and it has a standard set of functionalities like encryption, digital signatures, and so. Because this claims that it's supposed to be tamper resistant and sidechain resistant, it means they claim with security certification and external auditing that these TPM chips are supposed to be even secure against all sorts of intrusive attacks like a power analysis attack or physical attack. So here, even though these chips have such a strong claim, we do some timing analysis and we see that sometimes these claims don't hold when you do this type of analysis properly. So based on the experience we gained through basically microarchitectural cryptanalysis, we realized that we can use the CPU cycle count to do very precise timing measurement of the this TPM, and we found that when we execute the ECDSA on this TPM, you basically have a very non-constant timing behavior. So this TPM we tested is a TPM that exists on the same SoC, but a separate core. Intel PTT is the name of the technology. And then we look at the behavior of these timings, and we saw that the nonces in the ECDSA has a correlation with the timing behavior. So for every additional 4 bit of 0 in the beginning of the nonce, you basically have some order of magnitude faster timing behavior. We also tested some other TPMs manufactured by some other companies that they are not in the same SoC, but they are connected into the motherboard. And we saw that another TPM that has a strong security claims with certification also has a similar vulnerability that is basically developed by ST Microelectronics. So we again came up with a cryptanalysis attack, as always we do. And the idea here is that we basically have a TPM that is programmed with the unknown ECDSA key, and we collect a list of signatures and time the measurement for time the operation for each of the signatures. And we can filter the signatures based on that time and only keep the ones that have a known bias, because the timing tells us how many bits of bias that signature has. So then we come with a lattice-based attack to recover the key from those filtered signatures. The lattice-based attack, the idea is that if you reformulate one of these ECDSA equations, we have a simpler form here, that in this simpler form, A and B are noun values based on just the signature and the hash, but KI is the nonce, is private, and D is also the private key. So by default, you cannot calculate one from the other from this equation, but the value of X here is an upper bound for how big KI can be. And this X is leaked through that side channel. And this becomes a standard instance of a hidden number problem that was studied by Bona and Venkatasan a long time ago. So we defined a lattice construction. This lattice construction uses this public information and the value of the X, the upper bound. And then when you feed this lattice to a lattice solver algorithm like LLR or BKZ, you can recover the private key. And here are some results. For example, there are more detail in the paper, but the idea is that all these ECDSA-based, all these elliptic curve-based signatures in Intel FTPM and ST Microelectronics are vulnerable, and you can recover the private keys efficiently in a couple of minutes by timing these signatures, or in 80 minutes on ST Microelectronics by collecting enough signatures. We also did these attacks over a network because we see that these devices claim even physical security, but they even make the security worse because you can even attack a system over a network. So we configured a VPN solution to use TPM as part of a standard configuration. A strong SAN was supported. And when we do that, again, an attacker can measure the time over the network and do the similar attack. But this time, the attack is much more noisier and we need to have more signatures. So we collected 44,000 handshakes in 5 hours, and essentially you could recover the private key remotely with 60–70% success rate. And here also we see that some of the timing margins. So the timing difference for each of those different window in ECDSA was like more than a millisecond. And on this local network, we have less than a millisecond round trip. So this kind of shows how on a faster network, this behavior can be observable, and we managed to exploit this. So I'm going to conclude my talk with some lesson learned and things we understood from these studies. So our work basically improved understanding of the software-based side chain attacks, and it helps these future CPUs, future architectures, and future cryptographic softwares to be more secure, because now we help some vendors, and we also basically expose this knowledge so people can make things more secure. One important thing we learn is that proper threat modeling is really crucial here when we do this analysis, because these attacks applies across many different threat models, CPUs, and these microarchitectures are part of any system. And it's important to understand that sometimes these vulnerabilities occur because some designs are ported from one threat model to another, and IntelliStreaks and some of the cryptography implementation are example of those, because they are not designed at first place with the trusted-based computing model, but then later on, when you use them in that threat model, things can be insecure. The other point is that automated testing is really important. Transinter shows that it can be used to verify hardware or improve the analysis of our work. And it's also important for software. We have designed other tools, like in some of the secondary collaboration, like Microarchitectural, that can help to identify vulnerabilities at the software code and reduces the analysis effort. And finally, it's also important to realize that this sort of security analysis has to be done in all layers. Hardware and security are not separate problems, and we need to work together on all of these problems. So this is a summary of some of the papers I published during my PhD. Some of them I did more work, some of them with collaborations. There are papers in like top academic venues in our field. And I would also like to mention some of the vulnerabilities we disclosed to vendors, and we initiated with them in a coordinated disclosure, so they timely fix these vulnerabilities and make sure future products are secure. I would also like to acknowledge and thanks both collaborators and sponsors during this past couple of years. I worked with people across different time zones from different universities, from our lab, WPI, from University of Lübeck, from KU Leuven, Jo Wembolk, and from Graz University, and from UCSD and Adelaide and some other places. So it was really a privilege to work with all these people, and also it was great to be sponsored with these different agencies. So thank you for listening to my talk, and here are also some of the coverage some of our work got in different news medias. And one thing I like is really this article written by Ari Singer, who is actually used to be part of the Trusted Computing group. And it's really informative to read this article he has written on the TPM file in the dark reading blog. With that, I would like to conclude, and I would be happy to take more questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Daniel. Any questions? We are still in the public session, so if anybody likes to ask questions, feel free to come in.
I just want to echo what Daniel said. I think this is a very, very impressive track record, and this is a ton of work.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the comment. Any other comments, questions?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel, for the outstanding presentation. Of course, it was a joy to follow. I've actually one question. I liked what you showed at the end, that in your conclusion, basically that you're saying, okay, the problems are not really disconnected security issues between hardware and software, since a lot of things happen at the interface. And you presented the Transinter tool, which is really nice, because you actually managed to find problems in the hardware on a purely software based, using only software, right? So there are other approaches that try to analyze the hardware design, but basically you can do this even on an Intel processor, where you will surely not get any information how it is implemented, right? You will not get the hardware design. So and in the beginning, you asked this question: what does it take to? You basically said we did not. When the first attacks occur, we do not really understand what is behind them, and that's why the first fixes are usually only not sufficient, or basically may only fix parts. So there I already had the question: what does it actually take to fully understand an attack, and or to be maybe to connect it to the Transcenter tool, because I think that's your answer to that question. What do you think might be missed by such a tool? Because in the end, you still give the parameters in, right? You basically say which parts of the hardware of the of the CPU, of the registers, and so on. You actually want to influence, right? Flags and things like that. So one question makes sense.
Yeah, so if I understand, yeah, thanks for the insight. But if I also understand the questions correctly, so you're asking what does it take to essentially, can you repeat the basically highlight of your question?
What do you think? So I mean, you put a lot of knowledge in. So basically, you had, I think, the way you Transcenter is designed, you need to put a lot of knowledge in about effects that will cause the kind of leakage you're looking for, the kind of security problems that you are looking for. So what does it take there, and what how can you try to further generalize it, right? So what might you have missed, basically? That maybe is the other question.
So I think one important thing here is, so we basically scratch the surface because we just do the analysis from the software. But I think in the future, we should see more hardware also tools, like things like, for example, simulations, like there are like simulators for like x86, like Gem 5 or some other architectures, but the simulators are not really even closely realistic to a microarchitecture we see that is deployed. So if we see more progress on open source CPUs or simulators that are more realistic, then we can basically generalize these analysis further. So instead of somebody manually go and check what are all the conditions that a CPU may check, you can generate those from the architecture. Like if you were, for example, inside Intel, and if the microarchitecture team was working closely with the security team, which I don't know if that's the case or not, but they could just generate an automated a specification that defines these are all the conditions that the CPU should go through, and then you could get those defined conditions automatically, and then maybe use a tool automatically to do this sort of work. So I think there is still a lot to do in terms of tooling in both hardware and software side. But I don't know if that answered your question. I think, yeah.
Actually, I have a question about the Medusa. So as I understand, you created millions of code snippets, and you were also looking for a new leakage. So how did you understand that the Medusa is the one that the new one? I mean, how did you understand that's the new one? Or which counters did you check in the performance counters to understand whether a code snippet is a new one or not?
So we have a list of basically performance counters we used in the paper. We basically use the performance counters that would be more related to the memory subsystem and events that can happen inside the memory subsystem. But that was also just trying out, because sometimes you may miss something for sure. But at the end of the day, the idea is when you come up with this proof of concept, then you have to manually analyze them and see which ones are leaked. So some of the things I did is, for example, based on the data pattern that I leak, because I program this tool to put some data inside the CPU, and then I see what data pattern it is. From those data patterns, I could tell that this data pattern is different from previous data patterns I've seen. But then basically going to the down level detail was a lot of manual analysis, because at that point, especially without having access to open hardware, it's hard to automate that part at this point.
Thank you.
Thanks, Berk. So any other questions?
I don't know. There is a question in the chat. I don't know if it's to me or or to the other.
The chat has kind of, you know, developed a life on its own. So there's excellent discussions there.
I'm sorry, it was meant to Daniel Gross.
Yeah. Thank you for your comment.
I think Sima's comment is just a continuation of that discussion. Yeah, that's not to you. It's at Daniel. Yeah, not your Daniel. It's the other Daniel. Too many Daniels. All right. So any other questions directed to Daniel Moghimi? All right. I guess we're good. And I apologize for cutting the chat discussion short. And I also like to thank Daniel Cruz, Michelle Schwartz, and Sima for the chat discussion. This for me, and also Anders for chiming in. It was an interesting discussion, and love to see continuation of that, maybe in one of these Intel workshops or some other event. But I would like to request going to the closed session now then. And I thank all the attendees for their time. And I kindly ask them to drop out of the meeting. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for the invite and best of luck.